Your support matters. With 90% of our viewers yet to subscribe, we need your help to keep creating engaging content. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know where you're watching from. Leave your city in the comments below. My name is Sophia Carter, and for most of my life, I believed in love. The kind of love that withstands struggles, the kind that's built on trust and honesty. My husband, Daniel, and I had been together for 10 years, and if you had asked me a few months ago, I would have told you our marriage was solid. Dan wasn't just my husband, he was my rock. A hard-working, dependable man who built a name for himself as one of the best roofers in the city. He took pride in his work, always ensuring that families had a secure roof over their heads. His hands were always covered in dust, and he smelled of cedar and asphalt, but I loved that about him. I, on the other hand, had a career in corporate sales, working for a wellness brand. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid well, and it gave me opportunities to travel, to conferences, retreats, and networking events. Those trips became a regular thing, something I told myself was necessary to keep growing in my career. Dan never questioned them. He was the kind of man who believed in trust over suspicion, and I thought I believed in that too, until the day I found something that changed everything. It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Dan was out back fixing the fence, and I decided to clean out the storage room in our basement. I'd been meaning to throw out some old boxes for months, and since I had a few days before my next work trip, I figured it was the perfect time. As I shifted a few storage bins, something strange caught my eye. A locked black suitcase tucked away behind an old shelving unit. It wasn't mine, and I had never seen it before. Curiosity took over. I pulled it out, my heart pounding. I don't know why, but I had a bad feeling about it. Maybe it was the way it was hidden, or the fact that it was locked. Dan never kept secrets from me, or so I thought. I rummaged through the storage shelves, searching for anything that might open it, until I finally found an old paperclip. I twisted it, slipping it into the lock, and after a few attempts, the suitcase clicked open. I wish I had never looked inside. The first thing I saw was a leather mask. Not the kind you'd wear to a costume party, but the kind that completely covered the face, except for a small opening at the mouth. It was jet black, made of thick, expensive material. But that wasn't all. There were thick metal cuffs, a blindfold, and a neatly folded black suit made of the same glossy leather. I touched it, feeling the cold, unfamiliar texture against my fingertips. The entire suitcase smelled like rubber and chemicals, and an eerie chill ran down my spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a joke. And I had no idea what my husband was hiding. My hands were shaking as I closed the suitcase and shoved it back where I found it. I felt sick. I wanted to march outside and demand answers, but a part of me was too afraid to hear the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the discovery over and over, trying to make sense of it. Dan had never been into anything extreme. Or at least, he never told me he was. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe it was something harmless. Maybe a joke between him and his work buddies. Maybe a forgotten relic from his past. But then, something happened that made my stomach drop. When I went back to the basement later that day, the suitcase was gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering. I had just seen it the day before, but now it had completely disappeared. Dan never mentioned anything about moving it, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. I felt like I was losing my mind. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I started watching him. Over the next few days, I paid close attention to Dan's behavior. At first, everything seemed normal. He still made dinner, still kissed me goodbye in the morning, still acted like the loving husband I had always known. But the more I observed him, the more I noticed the small things. He seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. He was leaving for work earlier than usual and coming home later, always with the excuse that he had a big roofing job. And when he thought I was asleep, I caught him sneaking off to the basement in the middle of the night. Something was definitely wrong. So, I took things a step further. I bought a small hidden camera, disguised as an air freshener, and placed it in the living room. I also hid a voice recorder in his truck. I felt guilty, like I was betraying his trust. But deep down, I needed to know the truth. And what I found out made my blood run cold. At first, the recordings didn't show much, just normal conversations, casual phone calls with clients, and background noise from his work sites. But on the third day, something changed. Dan was in the car, talking to someone on the phone. His voice was low, cautious. "Yeah, I took care of it. She doesn't suspect anything." My heart stopped. I turned up the volume. "No, she hasn't found out about the other stuff, but I need to be careful. She's been watching me." I dropped the recorder, my hands shaking. Who was he talking to? What was he hiding? I had no answers, just a feeling that my husband wasn't the man I thought he was. And I was about to find out just how deep the lies went. The cold night air pressed against my skin as I crouched beside Jake, our breath slow and controlled. The towering iron gates loomed before us, casting long shadows under the pale glow of security lights. Beyond them, the mansion stood like a fortress, its tall, pristine columns exuding wealth and secrecy. It was clear that this place was no ordinary retreat. Dan's knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists, his mind racing with questions. Why would Jenna and the other women be here? Who were those men? And what exactly was going on behind these walls? Jake exhaled sharply beside him. "We can't just sit here, man. We need to find a way in." Dan scanned the perimeter. The fence extended in both directions, disappearing into the dense tree line. Security cameras were mounted at intervals, sweeping over the area with mechanical precision. A direct approach wasn't an option. They needed to be smart. "Let's circle around," Dan whispered. "Maybe there's a blind spot somewhere." Jake nodded, and the two moved cautiously through the underbrush, keeping low. The forest was dense, but after a few minutes of creeping forward, they spotted a section of the fence that had a slight gap beneath it where the ground had eroded. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Jake tested the gap first, laying flat and shimmying under the fence with slow, deliberate movements. Dan followed, his heart pounding as he pulled himself through the dirt. Once on the other side, they pressed against the tree line, watching for movement. The mansion was eerily quiet. Soft, ambient lighting glowed from within, and through the windows, Dan could see elegant chandeliers and plush furniture. It looked like a high-end estate, the kind of place owned by someone with money to burn. Jake tugged on Dan's sleeve. "There's a service entrance near the back." They moved quickly, but cautiously, hugging the walls as they reached a side door. To their surprise, it was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it. Dan exchanged a wary glance with Jake before slowly pushing it open. Inside, they stepped into a dimly lit hallway with marble floors. The walls were adorned with paintings that looked expensive, their frames gilded and ornate. Everything about this place screamed luxury, but something felt off. They listened carefully. Distant voices echoed from deeper inside, and as they crept forward, the murmur of a low conversation became clearer. "Scheduled for midnight. They'll be in position." A man's voice, deep and authoritative. Another voice, quieter, replied, "And the others?" "The new ones will be introduced tonight. Make sure they're ready." Dan and Jake froze. Their stomachs twisted at the implication. Introduced? To what? They needed to see for themselves. They followed the corridor, careful to remain unseen. The hallway led to a staircase that descended into what looked like a basement level. From below, faint music played, a slow, hypnotic tune, the kind meant to lull people into a trance. Jake nudged Dan, pointing toward a small ventilation grate near the floor. It was just big enough to peek through. Dan lowered himself, heart hammering, and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The basement was lavishly decorated, but it wasn't a typical lounge or gathering space. At the center of the room was a circular platform, and on it stood several women, including Jenna and Lisa, dressed in long, elegant robes. They looked almost dazed, their expressions unreadable. Around them, seated in plush chairs, were men dressed in expensive suits, watching them with calculated interest. Dan clenched his jaw. This wasn't a retreat, it was something far worse. The air in the basement was thick with tension. A man in a tailored black suit stepped forward, addressing the room. His presence commanded attention, and the way he spoke suggested authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth. "Tonight, we welcome new guests into our society." Dan's hands curled into fists. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to get Jenna out of there. Jake whispered, "What the hell is this?" Dan shook his head. He didn't have an answer. A sharp clinking sound interrupted them. A waiter dressed in a tuxedo was setting down glasses of dark red liquid on a tray. One by one, the women on the platform took a glass. Dan's stomach twisted. He couldn't just watch. He had to act, now. He turned to Jake. "We need a plan. Fast." Dan's heart pounded as he crouched beside Jake, their eyes locked on the unsettling scene unfolding in the basement. Jenna and Lisa stood among the other women, their expressions vacant, as if they were under some kind of trance. The man in the black suit continued his speech, his voice calm but authoritative. "We have to get them out of here." Jake gritted his teeth. "This isn't just some exclusive club. Something's seriously wrong here." Dan nodded, his mind racing. The women were about to drink from the glasses they'd been handed. Whatever was inside them, it didn't feel right. "First, we need to stop them from drinking," Dan whispered. "Then we have to find a way out." Jake scanned the room. "There's a security panel by the door. If we cut the power, it might give us an opening." Dan's hands curled into fists. Every second counted. He needed a distraction, something to disrupt the gathering without exposing themselves immediately. He glanced down the hallway and spotted a fire alarm on the wall. "That's it," Dan murmured. "If we pull the alarm, it'll cause chaos. People will scatter." Jake's eyes lit up. That could work, but how do we get to them in the confusion? Dan exhaled sharply. "We have to move fast. As soon as the alarm blares, we get inside, grab Jenna and Lisa, and make a run for it." Jake nodded. "I'll handle the fire alarm. You get them." Dan positioned himself near the basement entrance, keeping out of sight. Jake crept toward the alarm panel. The moment his fingers wrapped around the handle, he gave a sharp tug. Ring! The high-pitched siren shattered the eerie silence. The lights flickered, and within seconds, chaos erupted in the basement. The seated guests jumped to their feet, startled by the blaring alarm. Security personnel rushed to the exits, attempting to control the situation. Dan didn't hesitate. He sprinted through the open doorway and onto the platform, grabbing Jenna's wrist. Her eyes widened in shock. "Dan," she gasped. "No time to explain," he said urgently. "We have to go, now." Lisa, standing beside her, blinked in confusion, but quickly nodded. Something felt off about this place. "Let's go." Dan led them toward the exit, weaving through the panicked crowd. Behind him, Jake had already slipped past security and was waiting near the back door. A loud voice boomed over the speakers. Do not leave the premises. Security is locking down all exits. Dan cursed. They had to move faster. A pair of guards tried to block their path, but Jake, ever the quick thinker, grabbed a nearby tray from a table and flung it at them. Glass shattered, causing a brief distraction. Dan took the opportunity to push through, pulling Jenna and Lisa with him. They burst into the hallway, sprinting toward the exit they had used to enter. The door was still slightly ajar. Salvation was only a few feet away. Behind them, voices shouted orders. Heavy footsteps thundered after them. Dan shoved open the door, and they bolted into the night. Jake gestured toward the fence. Same way we came in. Go! The four of them raced toward the tree line, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Dan helped Jenna and Lisa squeeze through the gap beneath the fence before diving through himself. Jake was the last one through, barely making it before a beam of flashlight swept over the spot they had just occupied. They didn't stop running. Through the dense woods, their feet pounded against the forest floor. Only when they were miles away did they finally slow down, lungs burning, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Jenna turned to Dan, her eyes filled with questions. What was that place? And how did you find us? Dan exhaled, steadying himself. We saw the messages. Something felt wrong. We had to come. Lisa hugged herself, shivering. I'm so glad you did. Jake ran a hand through his hair. That was close, too close. Dan glanced back toward the distant glow of the mansion's lights. They had escaped, for now. But one thing was certain. Whoever was behind that place, they wouldn't let them go so easily. The night air was cold as Dan, Jenna, Jake, and Lisa stood in the middle of the woods, their breaths heavy from the escape. Every crackle of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of paranoia through them. We need to get out of here, Jake whispered, scanning their surroundings. They might send people after us. Dan nodded, gripping Jenna's hand. There's a gas station a few miles from here. We'll go there and call for help. Lisa shivered, rubbing her arms. What if they track us? They seemed powerful. Jenna's eyes darted around nervously. I don't even remember how we got to that mansion in the first place. It was like I was hypnotized. Dan exchanged a glance with Jake. This wasn't just some high society gathering. Something deeper was going on. They needed to act fast. The group trudged through the dense woods, exhaustion weighing them down. Finally, the flickering neon lights of a gas station came into view. Relief flooded Dan's chest. Inside, a bored-looking clerk barely glanced at them as they entered. Jake grabbed a burner phone from a display rack, paying in cash. We call the police, right? Lisa asked. Dan hesitated. Yes, but we need to be careful. We don't know who's involved in this. If the wrong people get wind of it, they could silence us. Jenna swallowed hard. What do we do then? Dan exhaled sharply. Think it's. We call an anonymous tip in. Say that something dangerous is happening at that mansion. But we don't give them our names. Jake nodded. Smart. We keep our distance but still get help involved. Dan dialed, his hand steady despite the weight of the moment. The line rang, then a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Dan spoke carefully. There's a mansion in the hills off Highway 27. Something illegal is happening there. People are being manipulated and possibly drugged. The dispatcher asked for details, but Dan kept it brief. Just send someone before it's too late. Then he hung up. Now, they had to wait. The next morning, the group gathered in Jake's apartment, their nerves on edge. Dan flipped through channels, stopping when a news report caught his attention. Authorities raided a private estate last night after an anonymous tip suggested suspicious activity. While no arrests have been made, Investigators are looking into potential illicit activities linked to high-profile individuals. Jenna gasped, covering her mouth. It actually worked? Lisa wasn't as relieved. They didn't arrest anyone. That means they're still out there. Dan clenched his jaw. Yeah, and they probably know someone tipped them off. Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face paling. We have a problem. Dan leaned in. What? Jake turned the screen so everyone could see. An unknown number had sent a message. You shouldn't have interfered. A chill ran down Dan's spine. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The room was silent as the four of them stared at the message on Jake's phone. You shouldn't have interfered. A sinking feeling settled over them. The people from the mansion weren't just going to let them walk away. Dan clenched his fists. We need to be smart about this. If they're watching us, we can't act recklessly. Lisa looked panicked. Smart? We exposed them. They could come after us at any moment. Jenna took a shaky breath. We have to go to the authorities again, this time with everything we know. Jake shook his head. We don't even know who we can trust. Dan knew they were right. The people behind the mansion were powerful, connected. They wouldn't let four strangers ruin their operation without a fight. But Dan also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them win. We're not running, Dan said firmly. They want us to be afraid, but we have the truth, and I'm not backing down. The others exchanged glances, uncertainty in their eyes, but also determination. Lisa exhaled. So, what's the plan? Dan met their gazes, resolve burning in his chest. We take control of the narrative. We go public. If we stay in the shadows, they can silence us. But if the world is watching, they'll have a harder time making us disappear. Jenna nodded slowly. Expose them before they can bury us. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is insane. Then, after a pause, he smirked. But I'm in. Lisa hesitated, then finally gave a nod. Me too. Dan looked at his friends, the people who had been dragged into this nightmare with him. They had survived something unimaginable. Now they were choosing to fight back. It wasn't over. But maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Bakar Desatn. What do you think? Do you think Dan and his friends made the right decision to go public, or should they have gone into hiding? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future stories. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd love to hear your theories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.